Even before I welcome any patient into my office, I observe a psychological phenomenon that is far more immediate and revealing. The way each individual holds their first cup of coffee of the day. You might imagine this is merely an automatic gesture, banal and repeated without consciousness. But I, having dedicated my life to scrutinizing what hides behind the apparent, see an involuntary confession in it. The trembling hand, the anxiety for the liquid's warmth, the sigh of relief even before drinking, all of this speaks far more than any word spoken in analysis. Coffee, before entering the body, already reveals the state of the soul. I often say that for many, coffee is the first patient they attend to before attending to themselves, and this reveals something fascinating. The morning ritual functions as a silent pact with one's own fragilities. The hot cup becomes a small emotional anchor, a symbol of safety amidst the internal chaos that each person tries, in some way, to conceal. And it is precisely there that the true power of this dark liquid resides, not in the flavor, but in what it represents to the unconscious. Observing people at breakfast, I perceive that the first sip is accompanied by an almost infantile feeling of reward. There is a gleam in the eyes, a brief sensation of, now I truly exist. This is not about physical energy, but psychic validation. The mind, exhausted from the night before, finds in coffee a kind of symbolic rebirth. That is why many say they don't function without coffee. In truth, what fails to function is the ego, which does not know how to handle the weight of reality first thing in the morning. I recognize this psychic dependency with a certain humor because I see in coffee what I've always sought in dreams, a shortcut to understanding what the conscious mind attempts to hide. Each sip is an attempt to flee from accumulated fatigue, deferred responsibilities, and one's own vulnerability. Coffee thus becomes a confession no one realizes they are making. There are those who come to my office to discuss relationships, traumas, and desires, but often what I really need to analyze is what happens to them before they even arrive here. The silent dialogue with the cup. Curiously, coffee also reveals each person's psychic defenses. Some drink it like a warrior, donning their armor, ready to face the routine. Others consume it as escapism, a moment of comfort to avoid what is to come. There are even those who transform coffee into an identity. I am the kind of person who needs coffee to live. This phrase, apparently innocent, is a declaration of emotional dependence, an unconscious way of admitting that one does not feel sufficient without an external stimulus. That is why I say coffee is the first patient of the day, not because I analyze it directly, but because it functions as a mirror of the human psyche before any social mask is put in place. The moment someone holds a hot cup, I see the naked soul, needy, restless, desirous, exhausted. And it is precisely in that instant, even before the first consultation, that I already know much about what that person is trying to hide. Coffee, after all, never lies, it only reveals. Allow me to reveal a truth that many refuse to accept. No one desires coffee for its flavor. If we strip away the emotional aura surrounding it, we would see that its taste is for the majority, rough, bitter, and uninviting. Yet men and women everywhere wake up with an almost desperate haste for it. What explains this paradox? Certainly not the taste. What is sought is silent relief, that unconscious promise that for a few moments the mind will reorganize itself and the body will find the strength to proceed. Coffee, therefore, does not satiate a palate. It satiates an invisible lack, a deep desire for internal structure. When I observe someone holding a hot cup, I see this object functioning as a bridge between internal chaos and a momentary sensation of control. There is something almost infantile in this gesture, like a child clinging to a toy to endure the unknown. Coffee, in this sense, becomes a transitional object, much like the security blanket or the teddy bear that comforts in the mother's absence. The adult, of course, does not recognize this return to emotional dependency, but that is exactly what occurs. The hot cup substitutes the presence of comfort, offering an illusion of stability that the unconscious embraces avidly. The desire for coffee, then, is less a desire and more a request for calm, for clarity, for a temporary suspension of anguish. This is why so many claim they need coffee to start the day. What they really need is a ritual that gives them the impression they possess some control over their own existence. Coffee does not awaken the body. It massages the ego, saying, "You will manage to survive for a few more hours." Thus, we see that the true addict is not the body, but the psyche, always in search of small illusions to soften the hardness of reality. And curiously, this desire is fed daily because it is never truly resolved. Every morning, the individual approaches their cup with the hope of filling an internal void, but coffee, being merely a symbol, can never fully satiate it. The result is a cycle repeated with almost ritualistic precision: the expectation, the first sip, the momentary relief, and the return of the same restlessness a few hours later. I often say that coffee is a promise that never fulfills all it promises, and that is precisely why we keep chasing after it. The most intriguing part, however, is that this hidden desire reveals a fundamental aspect of human nature: our constant search for external elements to alleviate internal tensions. Coffee thus becomes a small spiritual medication, a microdose of emotional comfort that disguises but does not cure psychic suffering. And the more fragile the individual, the stronger this symbolic connection to the cup becomes. What we see is not addiction, but a desperate attempt to stabilize an ego that is too tired to face the weight of daily demands alone. Therefore, when I say we do not desire coffee for the flavor, but for the relief, I make not a critique, but an observation of profound human complexity. We are creatures who seek meaning, even in simple objects, and who find in coffee a faithful companion to endure our own weariness. It does not fill the void, but it offers a smokescreen pleasant enough for us to move forward for another day. And deep down, perhaps that is what everyone is looking for: something to make existence a little less heavy, even if only for a few sips. Let me speak now about the ego, that poor entity which, since the world became modern, lives in a permanent state of exhaustion. The ego tries to negotiate with the id, faces the severe judgment of the superego, and still needs to deal with an increasingly chaotic reality. Naturally, it cannot cope. And it is in this scenario of overload that coffee emerges as an unexpected ally. I observe with a certain humor how the contemporary ego seems to run on caffeine, as if it needed this dark liquid to gather the minimal strength for mental organization. It is almost touching and a little desperate to see how a simple cup has become the emotional foundation for so many people. The ego, poor thing, attempts to maintain an appearance of rationality. It tells itself it needs to wake up, work, solve problems, meet deadlines, meet expectations. But the truth is that without coffee, it crumbles with the ease few admit. Coffee offers the ego a momentary truce, as if saying, "I know you are overwhelmed, but here is a brief reinforcement to face the frenetic id and the punitive superego." Each sip functions as a small loan of energy, a loan that, like all loans, charges interest later. The most curious thing is that, upon drinking coffee, the ego believes it has recovered control. It feels clarity, it feels purpose, it feels that life is, after all, manageable. But this control is illusory. Coffee does not organize the psyche. It only masks the underlying chaos. It is a momentary veneer of efficiency that vanishes as soon as the effect wears off, leaving the ego once again vulnerable to the bombardment of internal and external demands. Thus, the ego becomes dependent not on a substance, but on the psychological sensation it produces. Observe how the coffee ritual transforms, then, into a defense mechanism. To not lose the fragile sensation of stability, the ego clings to the cup like someone grabbing a life raft in the open sea. And the more stressed the person, the more religious this relationship becomes. The ego begins to believe it cannot function without coffee. But in truth, what it cannot do is face internal pressures without some form of immediate reassurance. Coffee becomes the intermediary between the ego and collapse. And here is the point where obsession sets in. Since coffee offers only a temporary truce, the ego soon feels the weight of reality again. So, it asks for another cup, and another, and another. It is not the caffeine that has become indispensable, but the momentary feeling that, now I can continue. The ego transforms coffee into an emotional prosthesis, an external support replacing what should come from within. This cycle not only reinforces dependence, but amplifies the fragility of the ego, which begins to believe it is incapable without its symbolic fuel. Therefore, when I state that coffee is the fuel of the ego, I refer not only to its physiological effect, but to its psychological role. The modern ego leans on coffee to survive a world that demands too much and offers too little. And although I observe all this with a hint of humor, there is a profound melancholy in this collective dependency. After all, an ego that needs coffee to remain standing is an ego begging for rest, but finding only more urgency. And perhaps that is the true tragedy of our obsession. We confuse energy with balance, and we confuse coffee with strength. Now let us speak of the superego, that austere, moralistic, and ever-vigilant figure inhabiting each of us. It observes, criticizes, judges, and never, absolutely never, is satisfied. Regarding coffee, its performance becomes almost theatrical. With every sip, it raises invisible eyebrows and begins the silent sermon. You shouldn't drink another one. You are overdoing it. If you were more disciplined, you wouldn't need this. Notice that the initial pleasure of coffee lasts seconds, but the internal censure can last all day. This is how the superego transforms something as simple as drinking a cup into a complex moral act. Coffee is converted, therefore, into fertile territory for guilt. And guilt, as I have observed countless times, is the superego's favorite food. It feeds on what should have been but wasn't, on what you promised to avoid but repeated, on what you judged in others but did yourself. Thus, when you drink the third, fourth, fifth cup, even knowing you don't need it, it is not the coffee that sits heavy in the stomach, but the internal judgment. The superego, always severe, transforms each sip into a small, involuntary confession. You failed at self-control. It is impressive to observe how the superego has the ability to transform a daily habit into a moral battle. It does not care about the flavor. It does not care about the body's immediate need. It only cares about the fact that you yielded. That is why the satisfaction coffee offers is accompanied by an emotional shadow. Pleasure is permitted, but only for a few seconds, immediately followed by the charge. Did you really need that? Escaping reality once again, aren't you? This mixture of pleasure and self-censorship is the perfect ground for obsession to strengthen. The superego also loves to compare itself to others. It murmurs, "Look at that person over there, they drink only 1 cup a day. And you? Why do you need 3 or 5? It creates an ideal of discipline so unattainable that any deviation, even a deviation as small as an extra sip, transforms into a reason for internal punishment. And the more tired you are, the more fragile your ego is, the stronger the superego becomes. It is almost as if it waits for the exact moment of your vulnerability to attack with greater force. That is why I claim that each cup of coffee contains a small symbolic struggle. On one side, we have the id, desirous, impulsive, seeking immediate pleasure and quick relief. On the other, the superego, rigid, moralistic, demanding perfection. And in the middle, As always, the desperate ego trying to mediate the situation. Some say drinking coffee is a simple habit. I say it is internal theatre, a psychodynamic compressed into an apparently banal act. It is not the coffee that disturbs the mind. It is what each sip represents in the symbolic field. Thus, when I state that the superego transforms coffee into a battlefield, I do not exaggerate. Each sip is simultaneously a pleasure and an accusation. Each cup is a small victory against fatigue and a small defeat before one's own self-demand. It is this ambivalence, this pleasure mixed with guilt, that makes coffee so psychologically powerful and at the same time so dangerous. The drink itself is harmless. What hurts is the dialogue we hold with ourselves while drinking it. And it is precisely in this internal, moralistic and tireless dialogue that the superego shows its true strength. Now we arrive at the most uncomfortable point, the one many would prefer to avoid. The contemporary obsession with coffee, this almost ritualistic dependency we see on every corner, is not born of flavor, nor aroma, nor the supposed aesthetic elegance of holding a cup. It is born of the emotional exhaustion that governs modern life. We live in an era that demands too much, charges too much, and never allows the necessary pause. And in the face of this profound weariness, coffee becomes not just a drink, but a symbol of survival. It is the silent way we confess, I can't take it anymore, but I must go on. That is why I say the truth is somber. We do not drink coffee for pleasure. We drink because we are exhausted. Exhausted physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The modern world has become a place where rest is seen as weakness, the pause as waste, and tranquility as a luxury few can afford. And so, coffee appears as a masked reminder. The body asks for rest, but the mind demands performance. Caffeine, in this context, transforms into a silent pact between the individual and their own exhaustion. I give you artificial energy, and you pretend everything is fine. The most frightening part is that coffee, with all its promise of instant vigor, ends up functioning as what we in psychoanalysis call a symptom, a small relief that hides a greater pain, a superficial solution to a deep conflict. Coffee does not cure tiredness, it only postpones it. It does not resolve exhaustion, it only disguises it. And while the modern psyche leans on this disguise, it slowly deteriorates, losing the capacity to perceive its own limits. Thus, the obsession with coffee reveals something we prefer not to admit. We are dragging ourselves through life, and coffee is our most elegant disguise. When I observe the long lines at cafes, the disposable cups accumulating in anxious hands, I see more than people seeking a drink. I see individuals trying to escape their own fragility. Coffee has turned into an emotional crutch, something we use to ignore the body that begs for rest, the mind that begs for silence, the soul that begs for a little peace. It has become a symbol of the modern human condition, always awake but never rested, always active but deeply empty. Coffee is not the problem, it is the symptom that denounces the true malaise. And if this compulsive consumption has a tragic touch, it is precisely because it reveals a cruel paradox. With every cup, we feed the illusion that we can overcome our own limits. With every sip, we believe we are capable of pushing life a little further forward. But deep down, we are merely delaying the inevitable, the need to recognize our vulnerability. The somber truth is not in the coffee, but in the fact that we need it to maintain a life that was not made to be lived this way. It is a silent pact with burnout, and every sip carries a small portion of sadness. That is why I say, with all honesty, that coffee has become one of the deepest symbols of the modern soul. It reveals our haste, our fatigue, our lack of time to feel, rest, or simply exist. It denounces what we try to hide. Contemporary life fragments us, wears us down, oppresses us, and yet we keep moving forward, cup in hand, trying to look strong. Coffee is not just a drink, it is a mirror. A mirror that, if we look with sincerity, shows exactly what we do not want to admit. We are exhausted, divided, and living far beyond what any psyche, human or otherwise, was made to endure.